$1 million. Jackson Whitmore's voice cut through the biting winter air to anyone brave enough to sit beside that untamable dog for just 5 minutes. The crowd fell silent. The challenge had begun. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The snow had fallen steadily over Pine Hollow since dawn, layering the quiet Montana town in soft white. Trees stood frozen under the weight of ice, and the distant mountains wore their winter coats like quiet sentinels. The town fairgrounds, normally dormant this time of year, buzzed with the annual winter livestock auction, a local tradition that blended rustic trade with the sort of small-town pageantry people looked forward to all season. But this year, the auction's attention had been hijacked by something else, or rather by someone. Jackson Whitmore stood in the center of the wooden auction ring, his boots spotless despite the slush, his coat tailored to perfection. In his late 40s, Jackson was tall, broad-shouldered, and always impeccably dressed, cashmere scarf-polished leather gloves, and a hint of cologne no one in Pine Hollow could pronounce. His smile was tight and practiced the kind worn by men used to buying attention and never having to ask twice. A former Wall Street name turned ranch-owning billionaire, he had recently made Pine Hollow his winter retreat and had a particular fondness for stirring drama in otherwise quiet places. Jackson raised his hand for silence, though the crowd had already quieted more from unease than respect. $1 million. He declared, his voice crisp and amplified by the echo of the wooden rafters. That's what I'll pay to anyone here, anyone who can get this dog to sit calmly by their side. For just 5 minutes. A ripple passed through the gathered ranchers, breeders, and curious townsfolk. Their eyes shifted from Jackson to the rusted kennel at the edge of the ring, where a large golden retriever paced. The dog's name, as everyone knew by now, was Rowdy. Rowdy had once been a therapy dog deployed with a U.S. military unit overseas. His golden fur, now dulled and patchy with stress, still clung to the elegant waves of his breed. But there was tension in the way he moved, a jitter beneath the surface, each footfall, stiff each glance, quick and untrusting. His amber eyes darted from face to face, never settling. He was 6 years old, though grief had aged him. After the mission that had changed everything, though no one knew exactly what that mission was, he'd been returned to the States. Since then, he'd passed through 4 handlers and 2 shelters. Every report said the same: unstable, reactive, beyond rehabilitation. Rowdy growled low, his teeth flashing just enough to make people flinch. The handlers, 2 stocky ranchmen with padded gloves, stood nearby, gripping long poles, visibly nervous. Even the auctioneer, a man with decades wrangling rowdy bulls and stubborn goats, had taken a full step back. Jackson's grin widened. "Come on, Pine Hollow. Don't disappoint me now." "Isn't there a single soul in this room who wants to try silence?" answered. That was when Caleb Harper moved. He hadn't said a word since entering the pavilion earlier with his grandfather. 11 years old, Caleb was a small, pale boy with unruly brown curls and wide gray eyes that seemed to study everything and everyone without fully meeting their gaze. He wore a coat that looked a size too big and boots with one lace trailing in the snow. Clutched tightly in both hands was a small object wrapped in cloth, an old wooden flute, the surface worn smooth with time. Caleb didn't speak. He didn't raise a hand or ask for permission. He simply stepped forward through the parted crowd and began to walk toward the ring, the flute pressed tightly against his chest. In the corner, an older man straightened from his seat. Walter Harper, Caleb's grandfather. Tall, wiry, and weathered by a life of ranching, Walter wore a felt hat pulled low over gray-streaked hair and a wool coat stiff with age. His face was angular, his expression carved by years of practicality and disappointment. Since the death of his daughter, he had grown quieter, sterner, never cruel but unreachable. Walter loved his grandson in a way he didn't know how to show, but deep down he didn't believe the boy could live in the world the way it was. Not really. Walter's voice rang out sharp with fear. "Caleb, don't." But the boy didn't stop. Jackson cocked his head bemused. "Now this is unexpected," he said, his voice carrying more performance than concern. "The quiet kid wants a shot." No reply came. Caleb stopped just short of the kennel. Rowdy noticed him instantly. The dog stiffened ears, pricking forward, his breath fast and shallow. A growl rippled from his throat. Gasps rose from the crowd. Caleb unwrapped the flute and lifted it slowly. The initials E.H. were carved into the side Emily Harper, his mother. She had once been known across 3 counties as the woman who could calm any horse, any dog, any lost creature. Emily had bright eyes, gentle hands, and a warmth people never forgot. As an animal behaviorist, she had trained therapy dogs, counseled military K-9 units, and often volunteered at shelters after work. Her name had been whispered like magic around troubled animals. But her life was cut short in a flash flood 2 winters ago during a mountain rescue. She had died saving a pair of abandoned pups. Caleb had been there when the news came. Since then, he had rarely spoken. But he never let go of her flute. Now, standing before a dog everyone had written off, he brought the flute to his lips and closed his eyes. Rowdy's growl faltered. He did not sit, but he did not lunge either, and for one suspended breath it was enough to still the room. The cold had not lessened, though the silence inside the auction hall now felt warmer, strange, and stirring like the moment before snow begins to melt. The flute's final note still hung in the air as if reluctant to leave, and for a breathless moment no one spoke, no one moved. Rowdy, the once snapping, anxious golden retriever, now sat beside Caleb Harper, calm still, his eyes wide but no longer wild. His ears twitched attentive, not to commands, but to something quieter, older. Trust. Jackson Whitmore stood stiffly at the edge of the ring, his tailored coat unmoving despite the draft slipping in through the warped barn doors. His mouth opened to say something, anything, but the words tangled and fell flat. One hand lingered at the hem of his coat as if expecting applause. None came. Instead, it was Dean, one of the handlers, who finally stepped forward. In his early 60s, Dean was barrel-chested with a permanent stoop from years of ranch work. His beard was a wiry gray, and his gloved hands had the cautious rhythm of a man used to animals that didn't always forgive. He opened his mouth, unsure if he was about to issue a warning or congratulations, but Caleb had already risen. The boy said nothing, only brushed the snow off his coat sleeve and tucked the flute back into his inner pocket. Rowdy stood beside him, not tethered or guided, just present. Together they walked across the ring, the dog's pace matching the boy's exactly, and past the crowd that now stared in complete silence. Caleb's boots made soft sounds in the packed snow and sawdust underfoot. Rowdy didn't look left or right. He only glanced occasionally up at Caleb as if following something more important than a leash. Walter Harper remained near the exit, his back ramrod straight, his weathered face unreadable. He had watched the entire exchange without moving hands clenched in his jacket pockets. He had expected disaster, feared it, braced for it. And yet, here was his grandson walking out of the ring with a dog no one else could touch. Walter's eyebrows knit as Caleb approached Rowdy, still trailing behind him, like a shadow with golden fur. Caleb stopped before him and looked up, not quite into his grandfather's eyes, but close. Walter opened his mouth to speak, but Caleb beat him to it with something far rarer than words. He smiled. Just the faintest twitch at the corners of his mouth. It lasted only a second. But for Walter, it landed like thunder. He hadn't seen his grandson smile in years, not since the rescue, not since the funeral, not since the quiet had wrapped around them both like an unyielding frost. "I guess we're taking him home," Walter muttered after a beat clearing his throat. His voice was rough with something he wouldn't name. "Let's go before this crowd starts talking." They left without fanfare, Caleb leading Rowdy, with no rope, only quiet resolve. The crowd parted as they passed. Even Jackson Whitmore said nothing. He only turned away sharply, his jaw tight, a thin line of tension coiled at the corner of his mouth. Outside, snowflakes continued to fall soft and steady as the Harper pickup truck rumbled to life. Walter helped Caleb into the passenger seat, then opened the rear door. Rowdy hesitated, eyes scanning the vehicle, nose twitching. Then, without prompting, he jumped inside, curled on the seat, and rested his head against the window. Walter drove in silence. The town of Pine Hollow passed by in quiet procession, white rooftops, shuttered windows, a frozen creek skimming under the bridge. They drove past the Feed and Supply, owned by a kindly, middle-aged woman named Shirley Bain, who was often seen in a red parka and had a habit of greeting everyone with a wave even when they ignored her. Her shop lights were still on, casting gold into the snowy dusk. Further along, they passed the elementary school where Caleb used to attend before being pulled out to learn at home. It had once been Emily's favorite spot to volunteer, especially for reading days. Caleb watched the windows pass, expression unreadable. Walter caught glimpses of him in the rearview mirror, Rowdy's golden fur occasionally brushing against the boy's sleeve, the boy's hand resting lightly on the dog's neck. They arrived at the Harper Ranch as the last light slipped behind the tree line. The land was wide and quiet, a place where wind carried stories if you knew how to listen. The farmhouse was old but strong, its beams soaked with memories and the scent of cedar. Walter parked, cut the engine, and let out a long, tired sigh. "You sure about this?" he asked, looking sideways at Caleb, already knowing the answer. Caleb opened his door. Rowdy followed. Inside the farmhouse had the smell of firewood and old quilts. Walter removed his boots and coat by the entry, watching as Rowdy paced the living room, cautiously sniffing furniture, pausing near the fireplace where the embers still glowed. Caleb sat down on the rug, cross-legged, and pulled the flute from his coat once more. He didn't play it. He just held it, fingers curling around the smooth wood. Rowdy sat a few feet away, ears relaxed, tail sweeping slowly across the floor. Walter lingered in the hallway, his heart a little heavier and a little lighter all at once. He didn't know what it meant yet, what any of this meant. But he remembered something Emily had once told him long ago in that same living room. "They don't need fixing Dad," she'd said. "They need to be heard." Walter took a step forward and said nothing. He just watched the boy and the dog, the silent exchange that no language could name. And he let it happen. The sun rose pale and quiet over the Harper Ranch the next morning, brushing the frost-covered fields in soft shades of silver and amber. The world outside shimmered in stillness, crisp winter air, the distant hush of pine trees under snow, the occasional caw of a raven passing overhead. Inside the farmhouse, the silence was a different kind, more tentative than peaceful. Rowdy had not entered the house. Despite the fire crackling low in the stone hearth, despite Caleb gently patting the rug beside him, the night before the golden retriever had curled himself near the front door and stayed there all night. His body pressed tight to the wooden floor, his head resting on crossed paws, ears perked at every creak and draft. He hadn't barked, growled, or whined, but neither had he closed his eyes for long, as if sleep itself might betray him. When Caleb padded down the stairs, just past 6, his slippers soft against the wood, Rowdy lifted his head immediately. He didn't wag his tail or move, just watched waiting. The boy didn't speak. He sat beside the dog and pulled his wooden flute from the pocket of his sweatshirt. He didn't play it, yet only held it for a long moment, then opened his small leather-bound notebook. His fingers moved with focus, writing without rush. Caleb's notebook was filled with careful sketches and notes, things he observed but never said aloud. The page he turned to now was marked Rowdy. First night. He jotted down the position the dog had slept in, the length of time he had rested, the fact that he hadn't touched the food bowl in the corner. Walter entered the kitchen minutes later, hair damp from snowmelt and jaw taut with sleeplessness. He paused when he saw them, his grandson writing quietly, and the dog watching like a sentinel. "Still won't come in," Walter muttered, pouring black coffee into an old enamel mug. Caleb shook his head once. "He'll eat when he's hungry. They always do." Caleb didn't respond. He looked up for only a second, then back to his notebook. Walter sighed and stepped outside to feed the chickens. Later that morning, the sound of a familiar engine stirred the quiet again. A small, dust-coated pickup truck rolled down the gravel drive, tires crackling over frost and pine needles. Behind the wheel sat Clara Mayfield, a woman whose presence often arrived before her truck did like wind preceding a storm. Clara was 73 years old, broad-shouldered and straight-backed, despite the years, with short-cropped white hair that curled defiantly beneath her knit hat. She wore a faded denim coat layered with patches, a hand-knitted scarf the color of moss, and boots caked in the dried memories of hundreds of pastures. Her face was firm-lined and kind, in an unsentimental way, the face of a woman who had witnessed too much suffering to tolerate self-pity, but still believed in redemption. She stepped from the truck with a vet's bag slung over one shoulder and a thermos of tea in her free hand. She didn't knock. She never did. Walter opened the door before she reached the porch. "Clara." "Mornin', Walt." "He's by the door," he said, stepping aside. Clara entered and immediately spotted Rowdy still curled by the threshold, his head lifting slightly at her scent. She didn't approach. She didn't speak to him. Instead, she set the thermos on the counter and knelt down slowly, carefully at Caleb's level. "May I sit here?" she asked. Caleb looked up, considered her for a long beat, then nodded. Rowdy didn't growl. He didn't relax either. His eyes tracked Clara with a quiet calculation that made her chest ache. Clara turned to Walter, her voice low and steady. "That's not defiance. That's programming. This dog wasn't mistreated. He was taught that safety is conditional." Walter crossed his arms. "He's broken. No, he's afraid. There's a difference." Caleb, without looking up, scribbled the phrase into his notebook. Not broken, afraid. Clara set down her bag and withdrew a packet of dried liver treats. She didn't offer one to Rowdy. Instead, she laid them near the bowl of untouched kibble, then turned away and began pouring herself tea. "Don't face him directly," she murmured to Caleb. "Let him watch you do ordinary things. Dogs like this, they learn through silence, not orders." Caleb nodded. He understood that better than most. The day passed slowly, but not uneventfully. Caleb read aloud from a book about animal behavior while sitting cross-legged near the fireplace. He never addressed Rowdy, never beckoned. Still, the dog shifted closer by inches. By afternoon, he had laid his head just beyond the edge of Caleb's blanket. Clara watched from a distance, sipping tea and making notes on a yellow legal pad. When Walter entered with firewood later that evening, he paused at the threshold, surprised to see Rowdy inside, not fully, but over the doorframe at least. The dog blinked at him. No growl, no tail wag, just awareness. Walter didn't speak. He just set the logs down and left the room. That night, after Caleb had gone to bed, Walter stood in the hallway outside the boys' room, watching the flicker of lamplight under the door. Rowdy was curled just outside it, breathing steady. After a long pause, Walter went to the back room, the one they hadn't opened in a year. Emily's room. Dust lingered on every surface. The bookshelf was filled with well-worn volumes, texts on equine psychology, canine trauma recovery, military K9 history. There were sticky notes still stuck to the desk lamp, a photo of Caleb at age 5 holding a black Labrador puppy in one hand and a stuffed turtle in the other. Walter sat down on the edge of the twin bed and opened the top drawer of the nightstand. Beneath a stack of letters was a notebook leather-bound worn at the corners. Emily's handwriting curled across the first page in deep blue ink. They don't always bark. Sometimes they freeze. Sometimes they flinch. That's still a scream. Walter read page after page, each filled with notes, diagrams, treatment ideas, observations of animals. Others had written off. And in the margins, little drawings, Caleb's early attempts at sketching next to his mother's text. They had done this together. He closed the book, his eyes burning, not from dust. He understood now. He had failed to believe not just in the dog, but in the boy. The next morning, when Caleb woke, Rowdy was still outside his door. The food bowl remained untouched, but the liver treats were gone. Caleb smiled faintly. He picked up his notebook. Day 2. Closer. The Pine Hollow Winter Fair had always been more charm than spectacle. A gathering of neighbors wrapped in scarves and mittens, sipping cider, admiring hand-carved sleds, and watching kids tumble over themselves in the snow. This year, though, the energy was different. The tents were fuller, the bleachers packed the air taut with something more than cold. News had traveled. The boy and the golden retriever, Caleb and Rowdy, had become whispers on lips and footage on phones. Most had seen only fragments, the still photo of the boy stepping into the auction ring, the image of the untrained dog sitting calmly by his side. But today they were about to see for themselves. The arena had been cleared of livestock and laid with soft hay and wood shavings. Long banners fluttered above the ring, their corners rimmed with frost. A low wind cut across the fairground, making the vendor tents creak. Beneath the striped canopy of the main tent, the seats were filled with ranchers, skeptics, town kids with sticky mittens, and reporters bundled in layers of false cheer. Walter Harper stood near the back, his gloved hands jammed into the pockets of his coat. His sharp jaw was set tight, his eyes unreadable behind the brim of his wool hat. Beside him, leaning casually against the railing, was Clara Mayfield, whose weathered face was warmed only by the steam curling from her thermos. Neither spoke, but when the boy entered the ring, both breathed in at the same time. Caleb Harper, 11 years old, walked with measured steps into the wide arena. He wore a forest green jacket that hung too long in the sleeves, and a knitted cap someone had once made for him that still bore a stitched turtle on the back. He looked smaller than anyone had imagined, more fragile. But there was nothing hesitant about the way he moved. Rowdy followed. There was no leash, no collar, just presence. The golden retriever's gait was quiet and controlled his tail low and still. His eyes scanned the crowd without fear, only awareness. He didn't walk behind the boy, nor in front. He simply walked with him. There were no commands, no tricks. Caleb made no announcement. Instead, he simply moved, turning, gently, pausing, crouching, and walking again, and Rowdy mirrored it all with a precision that looked like magic, but was nothing of the sort. It was something older. Trust. The crowd leaned forward. In one corner, a camera crew lowered their voices. In another, a small girl reached for her mother's hand. For a moment, Pine Hollow forgot how to speak, and then a new sound split the air sharp, mechanical, and arrogant. A microphone crackled, followed by a voice slick with performance. Well, now wasn't that adorable? From the opposite end of the arena, Jackson Whitmore stepped into view. He wore a charcoal gray overcoat trimmed with silver thread and gloves so smooth they might have come from another century. His expression was amused, but his smile was hard. "Let's raise the stakes, shall we?" he said, motioning to a pair of assistants dragging a crate on wheels. From the crate emerged a dog unlike Rowdy. Ruger, as Jackson introduced him, was a Belgian Malinois, slightly smaller in build but coiled tight with nervous energy. His coat was dark sable, his eyes darting with feral confusion. A thick rope harness strapped across his chest like armor, and beneath his ribs were patches where fur had thinned or disappeared entirely. Ruger has been deemed untrainable by 3 facilities, Jackson declared. He's injured 4 handlers. Aggression, refusal to yield. But I believe what this town needs is proof. Proof that obedience can be restored. And today, you'll see it live. The handlers beside Ruger were stiff-armed and tense, one with a bite sleeve tucked behind his back, the other with a cattle prod strapped to his belt. Caleb stood still. Rowdy beside him, tensed, but only for a moment. Then he exhaled. The handlers moved to prepare Ruger, but before they could give commands, Rowdy stepped forward. Not fast, not aggressive, just present. He walked across the arena floor like mist through tall grass, his head low, tail neutral, steps deliberate. The crowd held its breath as Ruger stiffened, growling deep in his throat. Caleb didn't follow. He simply lowered himself to the arena floor cross-legged and placed his flute gently beside him. Rowdy reached Ruger and stopped 2 feet away. He did nothing, said nothing, just stood. Ruger barked once, a guttural snap. Then again, louder. Rowdy blinked, sat. The growl from Ruger grew erratic, more fear than threat. His claws dug into the dirt, his muscles flexed, then wavered, and then he stepped back. One paw, then another. He lay down, Jackson's jaw locked. From the back of the crowd, Walter stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice, didn't try to interrupt the moment. He only walked to where Clara stood and with a steady hand reached out. She took it. "I was wrong," he said softly. Clara's eyes flicked to him. Walter's voice was low but firm. He doesn't need a commander. He needs someone who listens. The moment held. Then applause rose, not thunderous, but spreading like a tide rolling in. People didn't cheer wildly. They clapped with wonder, with awe, and with understanding. Caleb stood again. He didn't bow. He didn't smile for the crowd. He walked to Rowdy's side, touched the dog's head gently, and together they turned, leaving Ruger quietly resting behind them. Winter loosened its grip on Pine Hollow slowly. Snow gave way to slush, then earth, and the brittle silence that had once ruled the land began to thaw into bird song and wind. It had been 3 weeks since the winter fair, but what happened that day had not faded, it had only grown. The video of Caleb and Rowdy had spread like fire through dry brush. First, it was local newsboy Calm's untrainable, dog without words. Then regional. Then national. Before long, it had made its way into morning talk shows and internet forums. The footage showed no theatrics, no showboating, just a boy and a dog moving like they shared the same heartbeat. And then the climax, Rowdy approaching Ruger, no commands, no fear, just presence, and how the hardened war dog had folded into stillness beside him. The moment was simple, but it reached people in a way shouting never could. Not everyone was moved. From the glass-walled office of his ridgetop lodge, Jackson Whitmore watched the footage on mute. His jaw flexed with each loop of the boy kneeling, each applause from the crowd. His assistant, a slender man named Greg Rylan, thin-lipped and perpetually tense, stood by the window holding a clipboard and watching snow drip from the eaves. "We've compiled alternate clips," Greg said, his voice neutral. "There's enough footage of Rowdy's early aggression shelter footage, training yard confrontations, handler reports. If we cut them with new narration, we can cast doubt." Jackson didn't turn from the screen. Do it. And they did. A slick, overproduced segment began circulating online days later, shadowed footage of Rowdy snarling of headlines that read, "Dangerous dog declared safe," and heavily edited clips that erased the calm, the stillness, the boy. It worked briefly, until someone leaked the uncut footage, the full performance, the silence, the bowing of 2 dogs in the snow, and with that, Jackson's narrative crumbled like ash in rain. Meanwhile, at the edge of town, on a parcel of land just shy of the old river bend, the Harper Sanctuary quietly came to life. The property had once been an old cattle range. Now the fences had been rebuilt not to enclose but to define. Walter had done most of the carpentry himself with help from Clara and a few old friends he'd managed to humble himself enough to call. The barn had been cleaned out and retrofitted with open-air stalls and soft bedding. Inside, there was no barking, only breath shuffle and rest. The main cabin had become the sanctuary's heart. A wood stove, shelves lined with veterinary books, and Emily's journals, and a hand-painted sign over the mantel that read, "Not Command. Connection." Rowdy was there through it all. Not as a mascot, not even as a leader, just present. He moved from dog to dog without expectation. Some barked, some trembled, some didn't move for days. Rowdy never forced. He simply settled nearby, let the quiet wrap around them, and waited. Sometimes it took hours. Sometimes it took weeks. But eventually, every dog leaned toward him. Ruger arrived on the 3rd week. The Belgian Malinois had been released quietly from Jackson's facility after pressure from local animal advocates. His transfer came with little ceremony, just a crate and a file marked "Extreme Risk." But when the truck pulled up the drive, Ruger didn't snarl. He just stared out of the crate with tired, red-rimmed eyes. Walter opened the door himself. Ruger didn't move. Caleb stepped forward holding his mother's flute, the one with the initials E.H. He didn't play. He just sat nearby. Rowdy approached the crate, sniffed once, then lay down beside it. Ruger blinked. 3 days later, the Malinois walked out of his own crate. 1 week later, he lay in the sun near the paddock fence, shoulder to shoulder with Rowdy. And then, one Saturday morning, Caleb sat beneath a tall pine tree legs, tucked in, flute in hand. He played not for performance, not for progress, just because the air was still and the melody was part of him now. From the corner of the clearing, Ruger approached. Slowly, cautiously. He didn't growl. He didn't lower his ears. He walked to the boy and lay down beside him. The chain harness that once clung to him like armor was long gone. In its place was only fur and breath and peace. Walter stood at the gate, hands on the top rail. Clara stood beside him, arms crossed over her jacket. They didn't speak. Instead, Walter reached into his coat and pulled out a carved wooden sign. The letters were clean burned deep into the grain, and he held it like a man delivering something sacred. They mounted it above the sanctuary gate that afternoon. Not everyone needs to be commanded. Some souls only need to be heard. The wind moved gently through the valley, stirring the pines, catching the last notes of Caleb's flute as they drifted skyward. And in the quiet that followed, nothing was missing. Sometimes the loudest healing begins in silence. Caleb never shouted, never demanded, he simply listened. And through that quiet faith, even a broken soul like Rowdy found peace. This story reminds us that some miracles don't come with thunder or lightning. They come in stillness, in presence, and in love that expects nothing in return. Perhaps it wasn't just Caleb's patience or Rowdy's courage, it was something higher. A quiet nudge from God Himself showing us that healing doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it comes on four legs with eyes that have seen too much but still choose to stay. When we choose love over fear and patience over control, we open the door for the divine to step in. In everyday life, look around. Who needs to be heard, not fixed, not led, just understood. Maybe the miracle you're waiting for begins when you stop speaking and start listening. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment, subscribe to our channel for more stories of faith and redemption, and may God bless every viewer who believes in second chances. Type Amen in the comments if you believe that even the most broken among us can be healed by love.